we're coming to the home stretch here, and tonight's panel is about recruiting and growing high-performing engineering teams. We have two phenomenal Datadog guests. We have my colleague Ambra. She's our VP of Technical Recruiting, and Jeromy, our SVP of Engineering. And we're going to dive right in. And in prepping, we discussed a little bit how we kick this off. And one of the big questions that keeps coming up is, what role should current engineers play in the recruiting process? And I know you both have opinions, and I'll throw the ball over to you, Jeromy.
Yeah, happy to start. So I've always held the opinion that every engineer has a role to play in the growth of the company. So generally seeing some participation in the process, and that doesn't necessarily mean that everyone should interview. Not everyone is equally suited to interviewing, although I think everyone can be good at it with practice. Some people will contribute in other ways, but generally I see this as actually a baseline expectation for engineers to participate in the process.
And I'm sorry to interrupt. If we can maybe close the door a little bit, there's a little bit of background noise. Thank you. Now that's the engineering perspective, and Ambra, I know you have lots of thoughts. You run recruiting for us, technical recruiting.
Yes.
So what's your perspective on that?
I think my perspective is, I agree with Jeromy in that I do think the earlier the expectation is set that this is part of the role. Expectations, particularly when you're a growing company, I think that maybe looks a little bit different in companies that are more stagnant in their growth, or maybe growing just kind of at an incremental pace. Companies that are growing at 15, 20% year over year, headcount-wise, that becomes a much bigger challenge. That it's like the earlier you can rein it, the better. And I think my perspective on it is, I think it's important to make sure that you're monitoring and aware and understanding of contributions, and where there's maybe outsized contributions when it comes to interviewing. You'll find individuals who are doing a lion's share of the interviewing in a company, and then there's others that aren't maybe pulling their weight. As Jeromy said, it's tough to make it a mandatory thing when you have some people who just aren't good at it. You do not want them interviewing, actually. It's almost like a detractor, and maybe that's a growth opportunity for them, but let's not try that out on future employees. But then I also feel like it's important to understand who does it really well. And I think that's the thing we're at the size now at Datadog where I do feel like it's a lot more challenging to kind of wrangle the data with interviewing and outcomes and tying the good interviewers, and by good I mean like accurate in their assessment to the outcomes. And so I would definitely recommend, I think, if I could go and do things differently and kind of build earlier on, I would want to have a better gauge of how we track and monitor and understand the contributions and the accuracy of those contributions. Because I do think that one of the ways that you do incentivize this work, other than saying it's part of your job expectations, or maybe it's part of the expectations of a certain level, and if someone wants to promote to this level, they should be contributing and interviewing. But I think another part of it is helping them understand or getting the proper recognition around when people are really good at that, propping them up in ways that are helpful. Jeromy and I both also worked for another small, lesser-known company called Meta, and one of the things about interviewing there was that there was a lot of data around interviewing, and one of the things you were able to see through the internal tools and what was built was you could see the histogram, or you could see an interviewer's propensity to say yes versus no, and are they a harder interviewer, or are they a little bit of a softer interviewer? And so I think the more you can kind of understand the data around your interviewing, the better you can support the engineers who are participating in it.
Mm-hmm. I'll just add one thing. I agree with, of course, everything Ambra said, but in the spirit of sort of seeing who's good at it, the process of shadowing and reverse shadowing for interviewer training, and the overall interviewer sort of training and preparation process, I think is really important. And in the shadow case, having a new interviewer actually observing an experienced interviewer performing an interview as generally a silent participant, and then the reverse, where a new interviewer is actually conducting the interview and they're being reverse shadowed by an experienced interviewer that can then give them feedback. And then putting some controls in this process where the reverse shadower actually has some say in, we don't do it this way at Datadog, but where the reverse shadower has some say in saying, yeah, this person is ready to go. They should step up to solo. We had something like that at Meta. I think that's a really good mechanism to build a quality cycle into the process. And then, of course, the data.
So as we go into the process of interviewing, I know we're always trying to look for different characteristics in great engineers. So if we want to balance things like technical assessments, behavioral questions, and also system design, how do we go about that?
I think you should answer that one first.
So lots of thoughts on this, and it's evolving, as I'm sure we're going to get to how interviewing is evolving in today's world with AI.
I have an AI question for you at the end. Yeah.
Good. We're gonna need that. There's always a balance to strike, right? We're trying to get enough signal to determine whether this individual is going to be successful in the company at Datadog, and that's both will they have an impact, and will they grow as individuals? And finding the right signal in a variety of different interview types is a challenging exercise. Behavioral questions are important, but are also extremely prone to bias, right? There's lots of ways for behavioral questions to just be influenced very dramatically by the attitude of or opinion or perspective of the interviewer. Comes back to data to help control for that. So you have to take behavioral interviews with a measure of balance against all of the signal that's being acquired. So rather than having, although we do have this, rather than having exclusively behavioral interview types that are only looking for that signal, instead looking for behavioral signal across all interviews, all interview types, and asking interviewers, the kind of a little bit silly question of, would you want to work with this person? There's a lot of signal in that. Would you like to have this person on your team? Would you feel comfortable collaborating with them? There's a lot of signal in that. Again, lots of bias, but you ask every interviewer that question about a given candidate, and you can get a sort of triangulated view. On the technical side, design interviews have evolved a lot, right? Back not that long ago, when every design interview question that we all use in the industry wasn't just out there on the internet for you to go look up, study, practice. We could approach it in one way. These days, we have to assume that every design interview question that we use is generally pretty well known. There's actually some really great training out there that you can consult. But I find the design interviews specifically as a great sort of testing ground for dialogue with a candidate. Right? The more senior the engineer, the more the more fruitful it can be, the more directions it can go. But this really does demand that the interviewer be practiced and experienced in sort of drawing out signal and just asking, like, how would you design this sort of whatever system, and sort of stopping when you get a diagram. That's pretty boring. There's not a lot of signal there. But an interviewer that can actually guide a candidate to go deeper in places and find out, okay, well, they bottom out kind of here in messaging systems. They can go deeper in databases. We talked about a bunch of language frameworks. They've got a breadth of experience there. That kind of signal is very rich and very, very useful to the overall process. But again, this demands high bars being set for the interviewers. So I think that we do a pretty good job at Datadog of balancing our interview sort of process across all of these different kinds of signals, but design is the one where I think there's the richest opportunity to collect signal.
The one thing I'd add into that is on the talking about behavioral interviewing and the subjectivity of some of that. One of the things that I wouldn't undersell is the importance of some sort of debrief mechanism. Whether it's live or whether it's asynchronously, this idea that interviewing is not always binary yes or no. It can sometimes be, unfortunately, too gray when you have a group of people that are sort of like meh, you know, in their interview feedback, which is probably signal that it's a no. But I think oftentimes there can be mixed signal, or there can be someone who picked up on something that would be maybe behaviorally not in alignment with the values of that particular company and organization. But then you kind of talk about it somehow, and you kind of shake out, okay, that was a one-off. No one else picked up on that. Or that's not, you know, that wasn't a consistent enough signal. And oftentimes I find debrief helpful in not necessarily convincing, but I think in some cases, I've been on interview panels myself where you're like, on my particular area that you asked me to focus on, I'm a no, but in the context of listening to all of the feedback, I actually am a yes, you know? And so I think that figuring out how to make sure that the interviewing isn't black and white is, I think, important in kind of wading through the balance of, you know, strong technically and weaker in some other areas, and when you can make that trade-off.
Yeah, just one point of opinion on debrief. I think I agree completely that it's a very valuable part of the process, but you have to be very careful that it doesn't induce a groupthink kind of approach or a result where, you know, the person that speaks first kind of forms an opinion for the group that then gets sort of just adopted by the rest of the participants. So rather you have to insist that everyone has a perspective. Yes, it can be, you know, adapted as they hear more signal from the other interviewers, but you just have to be careful that you don't end up with, you know, just whoever has maybe authority in the room ends up just making the decision.
Completely agree. I would also say, I think depending upon what your applicant tracking system is or tooling that you utilize for these kinds of things, and some companies haven't yet even adopted a tool, which is always scary for me as a recruiting leader. But nevertheless, many of these tools have, you know, an input way of putting feedback in, and usually it's designed this way, but I always recommend, you know, that everyone is not allowed to see any of the other feedback before they enter their own, because to Jeremy's point, like being able to form that independent opinion outside of any other influence is really, really important to make sure that you can hopefully own your decision and not be swayed otherwise. Yeah.
So then we discussed what the existing engineering team, what role it should play in the hiring process. We just talked about the balances. So let's assume day one, I start. We have a 30, 60, 90-day plan, but long term, for us to maintain a healthy organization with career opportunities and mentoring opportunities, how do we go about that, right? And we have two different paths usually. There's the IC path, or you can an individual contributor, or you can go into a managerial position. Like, how do we provide mentorship opportunities and growing opportunities in the company?
You want to start?
Sure, I'll weigh in on this. So for me as a recruiting leader, one of the things I am not necessarily responsible for, but I care quite a bit about, is retention. And you know, of course, attrition has a direct impact on the amount of work that my team has to do. It's also incredibly demoralizing to work in a company where you spend a lot of time, and this is thankfully not Datadog, but I do have peers and colleagues, and you know, I have worked in companies where that was not the story, where you kind of put a lot of work in, and you bring on individuals, and they're deeply unhappy, and they leave, you know, in a very short amount of time. And that's also very expensive for a company to, you know, spend a lot of energy and engineering hours interviewing and hiring people. So for me, one of the things that I often ask Alexi, our CTO, about, I often ask SVPs, our people team, is like, what is the level distribution in, you know, different offices and different locations on different teams? Because one of the things I've seen at various companies in my career is that when the composition of a team is like heavily senior or heavily junior, and there's not necessarily a good mix, what can happen is you can have two lopsided effects. You can have a bunch of really junior people who have no one to mentor them, and so therefore they don't feel like they have good career growth. Or you can have a lot of senior people who are hoping to grow themselves, and they're going around looking for people that they can mentor, and no one can because they're just surrounded by a bunch of peers. And then you also have, you know, senior people that want to have someone they can learn from as well, right? So one thing I will say is I do think trying to maintain a healthy level distribution, and I mean, there's probably percentages we could just throw out there, but I think it also just depends on the company. I think that's one of the things that we have tried to do and look at when we're doing headcount planning, to make sure that there is healthy growth and support and opportunities for the engineers in those locations. That's something that's like easy, not easy, but it's something very intentional that we can do, or a company can do, that doesn't require creating a mentorship program per se, right? It's not a formal, it's more providing an organic way for somebody to reach down and to reach up, because those people are just there. And when I think back on, when all of us think back on like times in our careers, I value those times when I felt like, man, I am the dumbest person in this room. This is great. I am learning a ton. And then I'm also learning a little bit, and I'm seeing, oh man, there's some knowledge I can impart to somebody else. And that actually teaching people how to do things is also a way of growing yourself. So that's my 2 cents on that. But Jeromy, what's your take?
Yeah, you stole everything I was going to
Sorry.
say. Yeah, team composition, just to repeat, is exactly what I was going to say. Being intentional, excuse me, about how a team is composed, so that again, junior people have someone more senior to learn from, senior people have people more junior to guide and help develop, and then again, just being very intentional about this. And this largely falls to engineering leadership management to ensure that this composition is maintained. And this is in a company that's growing like Datadog is actually generally relatively straightforward, because you can hire intentionally against the level composition target for a given team. And this happens actually quite naturally in our organization, such that engineering managers are looking to compose a team so that these opportunities are present, both sort of junior looking and senior looking. In more stable organizations, growth-wise, you have to sometimes make hard decisions and recompose teams so that you shift, hey, there's some sort of too much senior talent over here, we should redistribute it. And that does also occur at Datadog, even with the growth. There are parts that are growing faster than other parts. And the places where, that are more mature, more stable, we find, sort of a progressively growing body of senior talent, well, we'll intentionally redistribute it sometimes. And one mechanism that we actually have, that we've formalized in the last 2 years, is a mechanism for internal mobility, where we foster people moving between teams, encourage people to move between teams. So when we have an open position, it is open for someone internal to move into it, as well as being open for external candidates. And that helps us guide this sort of composition in a way that's more intentional.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so maintaining that culture, look, we've grown a lot, right? And how do you maintain a good engineering culture and also team cohesion as you grow the organization and step changes, literally like from 10 to 100 to 1,000, and we're well beyond that now. What are the things you do to maintain that culture that we have?
I can start on this one. So culture, I've for a long time sort of maintained that culture isn't a thing that you describe or declare, it's a thing that you demonstrate. So it's the behaviors that we as leaders, that the organization, the things that we do is what defines our culture, not the principles. And one thing you'll find at Datadog, unlike Meta, there aren't a lot of, at Meta, there's posters everywhere, right? Like you walk, just show of hands, who's been to a Meta Facebook campus? Not that many.
Not that many.
If you do, count the posters. There's a poster everywhere that says something cute about
Cute, is that what you said?
I said cute.
Yeah.
About some sort of inspirational thing. It's not like the kitten hanging from the wire.
Move fast, break things.
Move fast, break things. Yeah, that's the classic. And then it was move fast, break things with reliable, stable infrastructure. I'm not shitting you. That was actually what it turned into. But they're all over the place at Facebook, that are trying to say this is our culture. There are no posters at Datadog because we believe that the behaviors that we demonstrate, all of us, are what defines our culture and our mission, our vision. That all comes from the things that we do. So finding the examples that we can celebrate and culturally relevant examples of behaviors. This team did this thing really, sort of delivered with quality on the kind of timeline that we wanted. They made the customer really happy. That's That's important to us as a company, that we make our customers happy, so we celebrate those things. We give people airtime in our all hands. We let them talk about their experience. And then finding the right mechanisms to discourage the behaviors that we don't want to see. We see someone as being a jerk, right? They're not, being collaborative. Well, we have the mechanisms in place to provide the feedback to counsel people away from the behaviors that aren't respectful of our culture. And one more thing, and I'll give it to Ambra. This is, I don't know if this is controversial, but it's certainly a perspective that we have at Datadog, is that we are an office-first company. We are office-first and remote-friendly. We have lots of remote employees. We strive to give them, the best experience that we can. And I think we might come back to team composition or location composition. But a lot of the culture actually comes from the shoulder-to-shoulder work, and we think that, and this comes directly from Olivier and from Alexi, people in the same office collaborating on a day-to-day basis. We think a lot of our sort of cultural strength comes from that. And we have, post-COVID pandemic, that induced a forced distribution in our workforce. We've now come back to a much more in-office centric approach, again, with lots of remote people. And I think that has given us a sort of a solid grounding in our cultural expectations.
Yeah, only thing I would add on to that is doubling down on the sort of like dealing with the detractors, detractor of whatever it is that you're trying to maintain in terms of expectations in the company. I think dealing with that, early and often is really important, because it sort of becomes that, I don't know, that like the groupthink, or not, groupthink isn't the right word, but like the cultural expectations of a group of people don't necessarily have to be spelled out in like writing or slogans. It can also just be how people are held accountable and hold each other accountable to what's okay and what's not okay. And, I've worked in companies where, it was absolutely acceptable and it was okay to, go at it with somebody in a very aggressive way in a meeting, or, call somebody out publicly, or, stand in front of the CEO and say, I really don't like this company, and, kind of be maybe a little bit less charitable in those interactions. And that was almost supported and it was okay. But I think at Datadog, what I've really appreciated is that, like, sometimes the collective deals with some of those issues without having, to intervene on a major level, because it just becomes like socially unacceptable to act that way, right? Because that is the culture that's been pervasive, and you have, the people who are the longer term, employees that kind of uphold that, and then you also hire that in, right? And you make sure that you try to hire in the right people that will come in and enhance the company, and not necessarily bring the bad. You want people to bring the good stuff from other places, but not the bad stuff from other places.
Mm-hmm. And I want to double click a little bit on the comparison of a stable organization versus a growing organization. Now, as Datadog, we have our HQ here in New York. We have a huge presence in Paris. We're in San Francisco, but we're also in Amsterdam and Lisbon. So as we've opened up these new offices, and as we intend to open up new presences, who's hire one in these locations? How do we go about it? Somebody needs to start there.
Yes, someone does. I think this is interesting. I will say, I think this is I'll be candid, I think this is something we're finding our way through at Datadog. We have a very good presence in Paris, and some of our other EMEA locations it feels like we've kind of grown in the right ways there. I think what's tough is going into a new location and figuring out how to do that the right way. I've seen some locations not seem to do as well from when we're asking about those health questions, and where it doesn't feel like it's totally made up in the right ways. But then I also have seen us do things like, sending people internally to go and be someplace as like a plant, to go and not necessarily move there permanently, but can you kind of open this office? Another thing we've done is we've tried to have site leaders in all of our locations, which is to take an engineering leader that's fairly senior, ideally maybe the most senior, but not necessarily always the most senior in that particular office, but somebody who is kind of in addition to their engineering responsibilities, has oversight of, all of the other things that come under trying to get an office off the ground and helping think about space and seating and, marketing and, not saying that all of that is their responsibility, but somebody has to think about that, and it's very easy to run a million miles and be in headquarters and just be like, come on, hire, grow, like what's going on? Like, let's make it happen. And, there are real people on the other end of this that are like, hey, you guys hired me in this office and I'm sitting here and nobody on my team is here. This is weird. So it's like really thinking about the dynamics of what it will feel like to work in that office, and will they have camaraderie? Will they have peers? Will they have people they can learn from? Anyway, all of those things.
Yeah, exactly. The site lead role is really important, because the person that is there in, let's say, Lisbon or Madrid, that can hear about the experiences that individuals are having, and help give feedback so that we can sort of tune the process, tune the composition of teams to offset, the solo person on a team in a location not having a good experience. Well, how do we fix that? Popping up a level, my philosophy, right? At Datadog, we have 2 engineering hubs, New York and Paris, and then we have only Madrid and Lisbon in Europe, and Tel Aviv in the Middle East, and Boston and Denver in the US. Those are our only official engineering sites. We have engineers in co-working locations and other places. In our engineering sites, we have very explicit growth plans to achieve a sort of a threshold minimum that we collectively believe is a sustainable minimum. And that demands that we have a diversity of projects, a diversity of kinds of skill sets represented, appropriate composition in terms of level. And that sort of rich balance across all of those different dimensions is really, I think, what it takes to build a sustainable site. I have unfortunately had the experience of seeing sites at bigger companies, Google, fail, because even at a big company like that, because the site didn't have strong enough leadership and it didn't have enough diversity of project work in the location to sustain it, when one of the sort of key flagship projects pulled out of the location, it wasn't sustainable. So I'm very committed to ensuring that we don't suffer from that failure mode at Datadog, but it does come from very intentional plans for how we build a new location. And that's why there are fairly few.
Yeah, I think satellite office as a term is like something to avoid. If it feels like a satellite office, the sustainability of it is tough. And like you said, that's where you see locations fail, because there's nothing that's rooted in those people being there other than working on something that's based someplace else. And they will always feel like second-class citizens. They'll always feel like a second thought. Whereas we've really tried to think about, okay, can there be certain teams that are housed out of this location so that the work feels, they get the same experience of if you were at headquarters. You don't feel like you're at a satellite office.
Yeah. And it's actually really hard, because when I was at Google, I was in New York, giant site, right, thousands of employees, and it still felt like a satellite. Right? Like Mountain View was headquarters. Yeah. So I was a director at Google. I had to go to Mountain View to feel relevant every 6 weeks, even though Google New York was massive. So this doesn't just sort of stop at some sort of scale. It's about how the norms are set in the organization.
So then we covered a lot of ground. We talked about locations, different team situations, and I'd like to get a little bit more tactical and talk about code quality as you grow and as you scale. It seems very tactical, but very important. We launched a lot of products yesterday. We announced them, and they all work. How do we maintain code quality as we grow?
So I do worry about code quality, but I worry more about sort of design integrity than I do about code quality as a first order thing. And I think that establishing a sort of cultural foundation around review and critical review among peers is really important. So at Datadog, we have an RFC process where any sort of materially sort of consequential design work is written by an engineer, and then is taken through a review process by a shepherd, someone that is maybe in the same team, maybe outside the team, but is at least a staff level engineer that actually shepherds that RFC through a review process. And that ensures that there are a diversity of perspectives, a diversity of viewpoints applied to a given piece of design work. And I think that this has scaled very well for us, and it doesn't break when you get to some sort of arbitrary sort of threshold of organization size. That's worked very well for us. The other dimension of this is we have a very robust culture of testing at all levels, from unit tests through yes, integration tests, but all the way through so-called game days, right, where we will artificially break big chunks of Datadog and validate the degradation behavior of the system, the recovery mechanisms, the overall incident response process. So that culture of ensuring end-to-end quality through both review and through test, I think is really what makes it work for us.
And then you mentioned it at the very beginning. We can't have this panel without talking about AI in the recruiting process.
Yeah,
Seems
this
like
is
you have
a
a
fun
answer
one.
ready.
Oh man, I gotta say, this is like.
I'm not actually real.
Yeah, we are deep fakes. No, I think this is like the hot topic among all of my peers and colleagues in recruiting across many companies, which is, how are y'all handling this? Like, what are you doing? And it's, I mean, the couple weeks ago, Jeromy, you and I were slacking about a situation, and you were like, "What is going on?" Because
Those weren't actually the words.
Those were not the words. I was being politically correct.
I used different words.
But what we're seeing is it's like a bizarre full circle moment where now all of a sudden we're recognizing that like there's a lot of value in being in person again for different things, and part of that is because our ability to understand whether or not what we're assessing is actually, like, that the individual is actually truly, number one, who they say they are. That's a big issue. The number of fake candidates are on the rise. The number of candidates who are who just don't exist at all, but also ones who are, they are who they say they are, but they're utilizing other people or other assistants to interview in the process. That's on the rise as well. And then you have also AI at everyone's disposal, and it's sort of this idea of like, is this a current we fight? Or do we try to figure out, if it's going to be a part of how people are going to be, performing in their jobs, then we probably need to figure out ways to assess this better and not fight the current. But I think a lot of companies haven't figured that out yet. Like, we haven't figured that out yet. It's on our roadmap, at least on my team, of like figuring out how do we integrate AI into our interviewing from an assessment perspective. And I know a lot of companies are trying to do that as well. But then we're also looking at how we utilize AI in our actual understanding of our talent pool, how we use it in understanding scorecards and things like that, right? Like, is there a place where we maybe can replace debriefing for, utilizing AI to at least give us some of the themes and the summaries and the proclivities, of like when we interview people in this way, they tend to be a hire, like those kinds of things. Those are some of the things we're looking at. But I think for us, one of the immediate things is ensuring that we're keeping some of the integrity in the process. And I'm happy to speak to some of the ways we're doing that, but like that is a big topic. Is how do we just ensure that we're actually hiring people who are legally able to be employed by our company, as a starting place, and also people who can actually do the job they're being hired to do.
Yeah, and that's the difficult transition that we're going through, right? Is that we're still assessing candidates and against a set of expectations that is evolving very rapidly as AI kind of grows in our tooling, in our products. So we're still looking at AI as a way for candidates to cheat. And what we need to do is figure out how to stop the modality of candidates cheating with AI and move to the world of candidates using AI in a way that's reflective of the job that they're going to do. But we don't know that yet. Right, fully. Although we are using lots of AI tooling, we can't yet sort of effectively assess how good is this candidate at using AI tooling the way we expect that they are going to need to, because we don't know what that is yet. Now, we're learning really, really fast, but right now our answer is, okay, let's at least ensure that we're getting high integrity signal and not sort of trusting that candidates are who they say they are and that they can do what they say they can do as a baseline. But we need to evolve from there.
So we're coming to an end here, but I do want to leave some time for questions from the audience. We have 2 microphones standing here, so if you have something that's on your mind, then please come up and ask your questions. To close, we talked a lot about hiring, engagement and scaling teams. Ambra, what do we do to, you mentioned retention as one important thing for you. How do we retain people as we're growing this quickly?
We were having this conversation over in the room about this, and there's no perfect solution on this. I think the thing that we all said and agreed on, and I see there's a question, so I'll make it quick, was really, if we're not talking about monetary, because my first answer would be money, right? RSUs, spot bonus, that always plays very well, right? But I think if we're talking outside of those mechanisms, putting your best people on your toughest problems is a great, sort of reward system and structure. When it's done well, that has its own pitfalls as well. But that is one thing that I think I try to do on my team. On my organization, my team. I know we try to do that in engineering, where we pluck people out of something to go work on something super special. And I think that can keep people feeling motivated and excited, because you got to go back to zero. I've never done this before. I'm learning something new. And I know for me, that always buys me time, and my longevity is if I'm doing something new. So.
Yeah, I won't add because we have some questions in the room. So,
please go ahead.
Cool, thank you. When interacting with engineering teams from acquired companies, what steps do you take to address culture shock? Also, how do you approach or navigate egos or emotions respectfully in a given onboarding timeline?
That's a good one for you.
Yeah. So I have lots of thoughts about this, but I'll sort of give you the one thing that I think that we've found most effective, and that is embedding experienced engineers in the acquired team. So yes, that team is going to plug in, and acquisition is going to plug into the organization somewhere, but that isn't enough. So actually finding experienced people from anywhere in the organization to actually send, and not as on assignment, like temporary, but actually, no, now this is your full-time job, you're there, this is where you're going to be for the foreseeable future. And that gives us a mechanism to mediate. It's not one way, right? It's not just that person is there to just sort of force the Datadog way, but it's also to listen and learn and bring back what they're hearing. And we have multiple examples of when this has worked, and the cases when we haven't done it, we've struggled for exactly this reason. So that's the key thing that I think we've found success with.
Thank you.
If you don't mind, I'm going to switch quickly over there.
Sure. So can you share some qualities or signals? Ooh, embarrassing. Can you share some qualities or signals you've found to be correlated with great engineering talent, particularly things that you can find kind of early on, like during the interview stage?
I have one that I always go to, and that's curiosity. So seeing candidates at any level, in any role, that are curious, right? That are exploring, that may know the things about more than the thing, but know the surrounding context, have demonstrated that they are interested in why something works the way it does, why it is designed the way it is. I find that a really good indicator of long-term success. It's not sufficient, but I think it's probably.
I think that's
necessary.
relevant for so many things. Yeah, in hiring, somebody will go a step farther.
All right, thank you.
We have time for one more, and I promise you we can ask.
I was going to say we can answer after.
Please.
First, thank you for taking the time to share your experience with this. Not to beat the AI horse to death too much, but I wanted to jump back just a little bit to its role in in interviews. And as an engineer who conducts technical interviews, I've come across some candidates who will show up and they will explicitly ask, like, hey, can I use generative AI tools in the context of this interview? And with the org that I work with, sometimes there isn't really a directive as to whether or not that should be acceptable or not. And since it's still a minority of the candidates that come across my path, I'm sort of still figuring out how to best approach those candidates and provide an answer to them that is fair and consistent across interviews, but is reflective of an actual work environment.
So right now, our default is no. So just because we don't know how to normalize, right? We don't know how to set a reasonable, sort of fair playing field. So we just say no AI. And that doesn't always work because there's lots of ways to get around, then if you discover you told the candidate no and they did anyway, well, that's a pretty easy decline, right? Unfortunately. So right now we're baselining on no. We know that isn't enough. That is dramatically insufficient for the world that we're heading to, but it's the only fair thing we can do right now.
Thank you very much.
Okay, Ambra, Jeromy, thank you so much.
Yes, thank
and
you.
I think you're going to be available for questions
Sure,
right after
yeah.
this panel here.
Unfortunately,
thank
not, but
I can be, but
Ambra,
you might not want
thank
to.
you, everyone.
Thanks.